finding this high density foam from the floor mat to be a really neat resource. What I've done is I put two small boards down here, just little shims, which are approximately half the width of this foam here. And I found that I can just take my little saw here and I can work my way down and cut this foam fairly evenly in half. And it doesn't take too terribly long, but it is a little tedious. Now when I get to the end, it's a little too hard to saw, so I just take my regular kitchen serrated knife, still using those wood blocks, and now I can just kind of saw this way, and there we go. So now I have some kind of irregularly shaped pieces of foam. I want to make another arrowhead. So to do that, this time I'm going to try some contact cement. So to do that, I'm just going to liberally brush it on both sides of the arrowhead. And then this is supposed to dry for about 15 minutes, at least 15 minutes, but not longer than an hour. Let that dry. And then I also need to put the cement on the end, the tip here of the bow. And we'll see how this does. If you remember, I used super glue for the other arrows, and that worked fantastic, but it ran out pretty quickly. So the contact cement may be a more economical way to do it if it works as well. Now, I've cut out the notches, the knock here on the arrows, and about 3 inches down from that is where my feathers are going to be, and they're about 3.5 inches long. Now traditionally, as the arrow is, I want the arrowhead to face this way so the audience sees it better. I don't want it to be like that when they're preparing, so I want it to be sideways, which of course is why the knock is this way for the string. But traditionally, the feather that is facing out from the bow is white, and then the other two are some other color. And that way you know when you're preparing the bow which way to quickly put that in. What I've done is all of those little pieces of foam that I've cut, I've put between little pieces of wood right now and clamped it together so that I can easily put on the contact cement without gluing all of these to each other. And then they can hopefully sit for about 15 minutes or so. So it's important that I get complete coverage on these because there's not much actual contact area holding these on since they are so thin. Now, of course, the thing about contact cement is that you only get one shot at it. So I'm just putting this right over the line. Then the next one. Just need to make sure that I have cement on all 3 sides here. I'll just let that overhang my workbench here. Oops. Sticky stuff. My hands are starting to stick to the top. There we go. Well, I think the super glue is probably easier to work with, but you don't get very much in a little container of super glue, so it doesn't go very far. Put that one aside. I think I'm good to go. So I'll just close this up and I'll wait for 15 minutes and then we'll start putting it together. Okay, I just spent the last 20 minutes cleaning the glue off of some of my clamps. Still have a lot more to clean, but it was a good diversion from what I'm doing here. So I'm going to attempt to put these fins right on the bows. Press it nice and firm into it. That seems to be holding. So I'm just kind of starting at the butt end where I've marked it. Well, if this contact cement is strong, then I think this was the way to go. Turned out pretty nicely. That's my first arrow down. So I'm just making sure that both sides of this foam hit the dowel by kind of turning it over each way. I think this is coming out rather nicely. Huh. Next up, so the most important thing about this is to make sure that it really adheres to the wood. And it looks like it's going to. I think I would recommend the contact cement over the super glue. That was very easy to do. So I'll let that cure, and then I can sand down this arrow just like I did all those other ones. Huh. So I guess the question is whether that makes any difference at all. That might. I have finally finished all of the arrows. There's a total of 14 of them. The green and yellow arrows are robins, and these white and red ones are Caspars. The arrowheads themselves I first painted black, and then I put a coat of kind of an oily orangish color on top of it, which gives it almost a metallic look to it. Here is Caspar's quiver. I didn't have time to record the build, but it was pretty straightforward. I just used some scrap wood for each side and the bottom, and then I used pegboard for the sides, front and back. Then what I did is, after going to Goodwill, I bought some old leather jackets for about 10 bucks each and cut up the leather. And what you see here is the back of the jacket. You can see the seam right where the shoulder would be, and this is where the collar would have been. But it makes it look like it was nicely handmade. On the back, you can see where I simply stapled that to the sides and finished it off. Then I took an old belt, a really long belt, and I screwed that into the bottom, and I screwed it inside as well. Put some duct tape there so that the arrows won't get held up when they're being pulled out. So here's what it looks like when it's being worn. This again is Caspar's. You can see that the arrows are easily reachable, and the belt just goes straight across the chest. This is Robin Hood's quiver. I made this one out of brown leather, and I think it turned out quite nicely. It'll look good with his outfit. One of the important details of the build is when you're finished to go back and use a black marker to go over all your staples so they don't shine as much under the stage lights. It ends up making it look like stitching rather than some basement project. I took the bows and arrows into school, and we had our first practice shooting. And the three guys did very well. And we probably practiced for about an hour and took over 100 shots, which means each arrow was probably used 12 to 15 times or so, and they held up pretty well. The tips, of course, were hit pretty hard when they'd hit the floor, and they kind of compressed and the paint came off, but that's okay. I'll redo these probably right before we have our shows, because we're going to still practice these a little bit. So I was pleased with that. However, I was very, very disappointed in my tail feathers. So this is what I had hoped they would look like. Nice and big so that the audience can see them. However, this foam really doesn't compress at all. It's pretty solid, particularly with the paint on it. And what was happening is these yellow fins were hitting the sides of the bow and then would kind of deflect the arrow off at a weird angle, and they couldn't really shoot with them. In fact, they would hit so hard they'd only go about 5 feet. So what I ended up doing is I had to basically rip off one of those fins, and then I crudely cut the other ones down very quickly so they wouldn't be really rubbing against the bow. And that seemed to work. So my task now is to make sure that all of the arrows look pretty much the same and then repaint them so that they look better. It's disappointing, but it'll still look good on stage with a little flash of color there. This is Caspar's bow. I don't think you've seen it all painted and looking lovely, but I'm very pleased and proud the way that turned out. It bends nicely, has a nice draw to it, but I wanted to show you the problems with the arrows themselves. So when I load in the arrow with the white feather facing up, and then I shoot it, this little fin right here, that feather, hits the shelf, throwing the arrow out of whack. So I actually pulled that fin off so that it's not hitting anything, and then I just clipped these other feathers so that they are more aerodynamic. And that seemed to solve the problem. And here is Robin Hood's completed bow. Again, I think it came out very, very nicely. And it has a lot of draw on it, but not a whole lot of power, which is exactly what I was looking for. So again, when I put the arrow in here and then release it, it's hitting that shelf right there, and that's causing it to go out of whack. So I just have to pull off that feather, and then everything works beautifully. The audience won't really even notice that that feather isn't there, but now when I shoot, the arrow can just go straight through and doesn't hit anything. I hope you've enjoyed this series. Again, this is a prop bow and arrow. If I was doing this for real, I would have done this totally different. I would have had forms that went the entire way around so there'd be no gaps at all in the wood. And I certainly wouldn't have bent it this far back. It would have a much different shape to it. But safety is what we were after for this project, and I think we succeeded. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.